welcome back into the Lions247 Podcast. Game week number 9 underway here in Happy Valley. We spent a lot of time on the last couple episodes of this podcast reviewing what took place in Beaver Stadium last Saturday, a 33-24 victory for Penn State over Indiana. Certainly dramatic. We've covered enough ground on that one. We're going to turn the page, look ahead toward Maryland just a bit today. James Franklin helped us do that with a Tuesday press conference over in Beaver Stadium. We were fresh out of that, Daniel Gallen and I. Daniel will join in just a second. We also hear from Tyler Calvaruso, our resident recruiting insider on this episode of the podcast. We'll catch up on the latest from the recruiting trail. Some visitors came through Happy Valley last Saturday for that Indiana matchup. We'll talk about some of the feedback, a new in-state offer that came out of that as well. And there's a lot brewing in New England these days for the Nittany Lions in the recruiting world. It's been good to them in the last few cycles as well. We'll turn our attention up there, and we'll finish out with Tyler Calvaruso by taking a closer look at the 2023 Penn State recruiting class and what its impact has looked like on the field thus far. But as promised, Daniel Gallen returns to the podcast right now. And Daniel, we're into week number 9 on this Penn State season, and you'd imagine there wouldn't be a whole lot of secrets left about a program we've been covering day to day since the first week of August, and yet here we are, 7-1. The first day of November is Wednesday. We'll be back on the practice field for it. We'll get a longer look. There are some personnel things to keep an eye on, but there are some very serious answers we still need from this Penn State squad to learn if they are ready to buckle up and take us on a push toward college football playoff contention.
Exactly. It feels like that we're still kind of waiting for the other shoe to drop in a couple cases. We're still waiting for, breakouts here and there. We're still waiting for certain things to come through. And I think as we talked a little bit about Monday, it's starting to get late, kind of early for some of these things. It might be kind of what Penn State has been these first 8 games is what they are, and not much will change, but we'll see what happens on Saturday at Maryland. I think that coming out of this news conference with James Franklin, we have a couple interesting things to keep an eye on these next couple of days, especially with regards to the injury front. He was asked directly about Trey Wallace, Harrison Wallace, the redshirt sophomore wide receiver, whose arm was in a sling. No update there from James Franklin. Typically, James Franklin will tell us if something is season ending. He did not do that there. So that file that one into the wait and see column. And then it sounds like we're going to see Caden Wallace, the right tackle, this weekend, even though James Franklin also said that Drew Shelton will play. So I think we'll get out there Wednesday night. We'll be able to see who's there, who isn't. And I feel like a week ago or 2 weeks ago, going into Ohio State, we were talking about how great the health situation was for the Nittany Lions and how things were setting up nicely. Now those bumps and bruises are starting to build up a little bit. So it's going to be interesting to see how these next couple of days play out.
Yeah, that's football for you. I mean, remember what they looked like last November. No Olufashinu, no Caden Wallace. They won every game, and they did it convincingly. So we'll see if they have the roster depth to deal with some of this. Certainly have some questions about that at wide receiver. We'll talk about that situation in a moment. But with Caden Wallace, if I recall correctly, when I brought up the names of guys who are kind of floating in the air right now entering the week and their designation for injuries, you pointed to Caden Wallace as kind of the most important one, the vocal point maybe this week. So to get that positive report from James, James Franklin isn't going to tell us that he expects a player to suit up on Saturday all the way on Tuesday unless he's very convinced of that. So I expect when we're out in practice on Wednesday evening that Caden Wallace will be repping out there with the offensive group. That's a great thing. He's playing the best ball of his career. He told us that last week. I think if anyone has just been watching without having to really analyze the game, you haven't noticed Caden Wallace as much, and that's why you've realized that Caden Wallace is playing the best football of his career, because he really is. It's his 4th year as a starting right tackle for this team. He stepped into that role as a freshman, as a redshirt freshman during that shortened 2020 pandemic campaign, and he has started every single Big Ten game for Penn State since then when healthy and available. Of course, he missed the month of November last year. So Drew Shelton's expected to be a factor in some sort. Maybe he'll get some rotational work. We did not see him rotate in at all at Ohio State. It was the only game that Drew Shelton hasn't played going back to last year when he stepped up. He did play 60-plus snaps in place of Caden Wallace, and how nice is it to be able to reach into a guy with starting experience in a moment like that in a game that proved very tight and have him at right tackle. But Harrison Wallace here. This is one that we've discussed quite a bit here on the podcast. And I don't know if we have to rehash the whole conversation that we had on Monday when Mark Brennan joined us, but he has been touted as kind of the unquestioned starter alongside Keandre Lambert-Smith for a long time now. And the conversation in spring ball was Penn State was searching for a third guy to come on board, and now James Franklin said they're searching for a second guy. Without Harrison Wallace, there are no updates with Harrison Wallace, as you said. You can look at that through one of two ways. One of which is we didn't hear James Franklin say he's going to play against Maryland, so we're not quite where we are with Caden Wallace. But you also didn't hear James Franklin say, yeah, we're going to miss Trey. He's done for the season. We look forward to getting him back healthy next year. So we're somewhere in between those two. Now, which end of the pendulum, where does the pendulum land on those two sides? We'll still learn. But look, Harrison Wallace, 15 catches, 160 some receiving yards. Those are both second among all receivers through these 8 games. With him out of play, Malik McClain was the next man up, went 60-plus snaps against Indiana, saw 1 target along the way. That's his only target in the last month and a half of football, essentially. And then you've got a lot of these other names, Dante Cephas, the long-awaited, addition from Kent State. He still hasn't gotten to 40 receiving yards in a single game. He's had a few starts. He played 40 snaps last week. He had 5 targets, two catches, 15 yards. And those were the only production. Dante Cephas is 15 yards at that position beyond Keandre Lambert-Smith. And so, Daniel, through 2/3 of this season, when you've got Keandre Lambert-Smith over 60 snaps and no other wide receiver at over 60 targets on the season and no other wide receiver at even 25 targets in this room, and now you're taking Harrison Wallace out of the equation, this feels like yet another week where we may see this team hit the reset button. It felt like they did it last week. They decided not to play Liam Clifford, not to play Caden Saunders, not to play Omari Evans. They decided to get Malik Mega involved. It was the first time we've seen him on offense in Big Ten action all season long, and clearly they decided to roll out Malik McClain and stick with Malik McClain on Saturday when Harrison Wallace was not available, and yet the production was not there. And so I say it again, may be a situation where you're resetting this receiver outlook on the first Saturday of November, and that's never good. And we just got a lot of questions, and then you're starting to run out of time to come up with answers for them from this first-year position coach and Marcus Hagans and a room of unproven talent for the most part.
It makes it tough because it's not like the cupboard is bare. Like you ran it down, I think, a couple weeks ago when you talk about the 8 scholarship guys, wide receivers that Penn State has added since January 2022 to that room. So it's not like last year where on the offensive line you get down to it and you're trying to save a red shirt and you have to play these walk-ons in these different spots here and there. I mean, there are scholarship guys that have been around for 2 years, 3 years, maybe maybe less than that, but who came in with a track record of success. So, I think that we kind of have to go back to what we were hearing in the spring a little bit and what we were hearing in August from James Franklin and Marcus Hagans, that it was all about consistency. And I think that that's something that maybe we can get to see practice. We don't see too much, but it came up. It just keeps coming up. I mean, James Franklin brought it up again today when you asked him a question about, you have all these players. We'd seen some guys earlier this year who we didn't see on Saturday. How do you kind of evaluate those things? And it came back to consistency and what Penn State is looking for at wide receiver. And James Franklin said there's some guys that can really catch the ball, but they can't make plays. There's guys that can make plays when they get the ball in their hands, but they have trouble getting the ball in their hands. So it's just hearing all this stuff from James Franklin. I coming out of it, I don't really have a better idea of where things stand and who we could possibly see on Saturday, what it might look like. But I think given what they've talked about with what they say that Harrison Wallace means and how they view him, I do think they're going to have to hit that reset button again. And I think that we're going to see a lot more. I mean, we've already seen a lot of 2 tight end sets, but I think that that's something that Penn State might have to lean on even a little bit more based on what James Franklin was saying.
Tyler Warren played 70 snaps on Saturday. That was a career high. He's over 40 snaps in, I believe, 5 or 6 of these games on the season. He did not hit 40 snaps in a single game last year. And, of course, for much of the way, he was the 3rd tight end. But you want to talk about a jump and a guy who has not left the field. That tandem at tight end, and you can maybe look toward the receiver room as part of the causation, but they are staying on the field for long stretches week by week. And I just wonder, the possibilities here. I know James Franklin he's trying to talk around this in a way, and he was pretty transparent about it after answering my question today, just saying he has to walk a fine line and not embarrassing a player or talking about a player's shortcomings in a way publicly that he hasn't addressed with them privately. He says he's very transparent. There's hard conversations. You'd imagine there's been some hard conversations with those receivers, with that group this year, trying to figure out where they are. Franklin's usually very hands-on with that position unit on the practice field, generally speaking. But, you come out of this and it's tough. You had those 15 spring practices. You had all that unofficial offseason summer work where these receivers are gathering with the tight ends and with the quarterbacks. And then you've got the official month of preseason camp, and you've got a bit of a soft landing with some of the way that the games went in September and through mid-October with blowouts and getting longer looks at guys here and there. And yes, you had the Harrison Wallace injury, and yes, you had Evans entering the season a little banged up, but now you've got all that collected opportunities to get eyeballs on these guys and try to wrap your mind around who they are as receiver profiles right now. And it just seems like even the head coach doesn't have a good feel for what he's got in that room beyond the number one guy who's already set career highs for receptions and receptions and receiving yards in Keandre Lambert-Smith. But it's kind of startling just when you think about how hands-on James Franklin is with this unit, how hands-on he was with bringing all of these receivers to campus and making that really proactive move and firing Taylor Stubblefield and bringing in Marcus Higgins, that we're here 1 day shy of November of 2023, and you're at risk of letting the season slip away from you without really ever finding that grasp of what this 2023 receiver room is or can be or could have been.
Exactly. And you pair that with the fact that you were elevating a former 5-star recruit to be your quarterback. I think that things seemed like they were very aligned for this group to take a jump. And I think that one lesson from me is maybe a quarterback can't quite elevate his wide receivers. Maybe that's something that you shouldn't put too much stock in moving forward. I think that's probably something I'm going to have to think about when evaluating quarterbacks. But I think that it leads to a ton of chicken and egg type things. There's all these things where it's, well, Drew Aller isn't trying to make these throws. We've seen him play things pretty safe. Then you're hearing things about the wide receivers not being able to get separation. I think everything is pretty interconnected when it comes to that passing game, but it just feels like that. I think James Franklin kind of mentions it every time he's asked to evaluate Drew Aller.
Yes.
He was asked about it again today, and he said, he's developing nicely physically. It's coming along nicely mentally. Penn State needs to make plays for him. And then he also said that Drew Aller has some stuff that he needs to work on too. But every time you hear something about how the supporting cast needs to step up, needs to make some plays. I mean, we saw it on that drop that Keandre Lambert-Smith had. That was just such a nice throw by Drew Aller, put it right on his guy. It would have been a completion in a big spot, and Keandre Lambert-Smith couldn't haul it in. Now he bounced back nicely, which for someone who we've talked about the mental side of the game for so long, that's really nice to see. But that's that felt like a little bit of a microcosm with how things have gone for Drew Aller this year, where you see him finally take a little bit of a shot downfield, play design works, someone's open, it's on target, and the wide receiver can't haul it in. So I'm going to be interested to see how this looks on Saturday. Do we see more Caden Saunders? Do we even see Omari Evans at this point? Do some of these other wide receivers who we're not even talking about, do they finally get a look? Anthony Ivy made the travel roster to Ohio State. I think that might have been the first time that we've seen him on a travel roster. Christian Driver, Christian Driver was also on that as well. So there are guys there that maybe you go that deep to look for something, but I really don't know at this point.
It's I think there's a couple things there. You're right to mention every time Drew Aller's development seems to come up, or every time that maybe the passing game frustrations come up, and the question is steered towards the quarterback. James Franklin does a good job of steering it at least back toward or kind of finding a balance in saying he needs guys to make plays for him downfield. It was one of the first things he talked about when asked about Drew Aller immediately after the loss at Ohio State and Columbus, and he brought it up again today when asked about Drew Aller's development. And Liam Clifford, I mean, we're talking about all these names. This is a guy who entered the season. I believe he was announced as a starter on the Jumbotron pregame before West Virginia. He had a big catch on the road against Illinois, and I think you noted that can't really remember a lot from him since then. In terms of big moments, I think he had a chain mover against Northwestern, perhaps, but he's now to the point where we're in late October and he's not getting any run on offense. And James Franklin, the door was open today. If you wanted to note, maybe other issues that were hampering a player's ability to get on the field, I specifically brought up Liam Clifford's absence, Omari Evans' absence, and Caden Saunders as part of my question. He did not specifically identify anything with any of those guys. So that leads you to believe that, based on the rest of his answer, practice looks and missed assignments in games before and those kind of things have accrued, and that's where they're determining who is being used. I think that the concerning part is here, and I'm kind of wondering about Drew taking those shots downfield, is how many times has he won those shots downfield targeting his receivers against this defensive backfield? Because James Franklin also always references with these receivers, while they're working up against these great cornerbacks, and we're evaluating them on a pretty high level here against our defensive backs and against our cornerbacks and safeties. And so makes me wonder a little bit, could some of Drew Aller's hesitancy in taking these shots downfield be correlated with what he has seen happen on the practice field when he makes those attempts? Because we're not seeing receivers in game action get separation against secondaries that we don't believe are as good as the Nittany Lions. It's just something that came up to mind today when James Franklin takes it in that direction. We're not seeing a lot of these receivers win those matchups against the Indianas, and Northwesterns of the world. Is Drew Aller confident in that group going up against the Nittany Lions defense that many believe might be the best in the Big Ten Conference? So food for thought there. A lot to work through with this passing attack. And I think one thing we can get into here as well, Daniel, is the defense, because it was an uncharacteristic outing for that defense. There's some lapses, 3 long touchdowns for Indiana, including 2 from their side of the field and a 90-yard play. James Franklin told us after the game, you get the same sense from the press conference here on Tuesday, that he's not worried about this defense. He knows who they are. There were some, tough conversations. They had to be honest about the situation. He says Devon Ellies stepped up and was really honest with the players, and Manny Diaz was as well. So we heard from Zakee Wheatley, and he was very honest about the situation. He's a guy who only played 1 defensive snap, and it was on that 90-yard pass play, and he was very involved in that pass. Zakee Wheatley even said, taking ownership of that moment and this defense moving ahead. Daniel, what do you make of it going against one of the higher quality quarterbacks that they will face here in 2023? Maybe without Chop Robinson, maybe without Amin Vanover. We're going to wait and see on those guys what we see on the practice field on Wednesday. They did not pop up during the press conference conversation. But let's face it, the defense has something to prove after what happened against Indiana.
Yeah, I mean, I almost feel like the defense was talking a little bit of a pretty big game going into Indiana. I mean, you predicted them to shut out the Hoosiers.
Why do you gotta come on, man?
Hey, we're not going to talk about
good. And part of that was because of what we were hearing from those defense. I mean, they sounded like they were ready to smash the turf with Indiana Hoosiers players. Maybe they were a little too, ambitious. I don't know. Whatever it was, that was not the same defense that we watched through 2 months of the season almost.
Exactly, and I feel like that there's a better chance we'll see that this weekend against Maryland. I think after refinding your footing, kind of resetting after a game like that. But I think that they're not going to be able to afford to have those kinds of mistakes, because the talent level on the Maryland offense is higher than what you saw from Indiana. I mean, Talia Tungavailoa is a better quarterback than Brendan Sorsby. You look at Jay-Sean Jones, Ty Felton, Caden Prather. I think I would take those wide receivers over Indiana's wide receivers. Corey Dyches is a weapon at tight end. Roman Hemby is a running back that they've gotten involved a lot more in the passing game this year. I think that Maryland has more weapons than Indiana. So, I think that if you make those same kinds of mistakes, they're going to make you pay again. And then if you make some mistakes that where Indiana wasn't able to make you pay, Maryland might be able to do that to you. But I think that this defense, James Franklin kind of said what I felt like coming out of the game, that the mistakes that Penn State had that led to those Indiana touchdowns, it was pretty anomalous. Like, it wasn't the norm. I think James Franklin said that he didn't come out of it feeling particularly worried about what he saw on Saturday. I don't think it's anything that signals like a long-term issue. I think it's just you make two mistakes, you miss two assignments. James Franklin said one of them was a blown assignment, and then you have to pay for it. I mean, that's kind of life in the Big Ten. That's life in college football. So I think that Penn State really, they do have to clean those things up, because Maryland will make you pay, Michigan will make you pay. But I think that overall the defense is just, in a good spot.
Devon Ellie's, along with addressing the team and making an impactful statement that way, he spoke with us on a Tuesday morning here on a call and seemed to really feel like there was value from their film review. You'd have to imagine many of these Sundays they've been getting together, high-fiving and laughing and saying, look at that play we made. This one was a little bit different. There was some egg on the face across the room a little bit, including the coordinator himself when you come out of a game like that. So I'd have to imagine, if anything, this is kind of going to be a wake-up call for them to get right for the final month of the season. Now, the offense has had several wake-up calls, and the problem is that persists. I think that we think the defense will be able to find its footing, but I think we'll have a pretty good indication early against Maryland, because this is a quarterback and an offense that has been shut out by the Nittany Lions in recent memory, but they've also taken it to the Nittany Lions defense in recent memory. So just a few days away from that one in Saturday in College Park. Daniel, speaking of Maryland, this was a matchup that you go into October and both these teams are unbeaten, and you kind of feel the juice coming from College Park as this one builds up. I look back to that September 2019 matchup when Penn State goes down and they're unbeaten at the time. Maryland's unbeaten at the time. I think Maryland was right on the fringe of top 25 status, and they had the blackout. And by halftime, most Maryland fans are to the exit doors trying to get drunk in the parking lots, because Sean Clifford, first-year starter, all that, they took it to them. And it was a blowout situation. And now here we are, and Maryland's not even going to get that buildup. They've lost 3 straight games before the Penn State matchup. They're 0-4, I believe, coming out of bye weeks under Mike Locksley, and that carried over into last week, a surprising loss for them against a Northwestern team. Daniel, this is your old campus. I'm curious what you're hearing coming out of College Park, because we talk so much about Penn State having a look in the mirror kind of moment here at 7-1 coming off a win. What is Maryland dealing with at 5-3 following 3 straight losses?
You think back to halftime of that Ohio State game. We were on the bye week, but I had it on, and you're looking at a tie game in the second quarter, and your head starts to go to like, okay, like that first weekend in November, that could be 2 7-1 teams, 2 8-0 teams. If you really let your imagination go at that moment in time. And since then, Maryland has just, I think, really fallen apart in a couple ways, especially when you look at who they've lost to. They lost to Illinois and Northwestern, 2 teams that we got looks at in person this year, and didn't really come away super impressed with either of them. Each of those teams had players who had nice individual performances against Penn State, but there was nothing that we saw in the total product that really made us think like, oh, this team's a threat. There's really something here. And Maryland got tripped up by both of them. You've got some off-field stuff happening at Maryland too. Kevin Sumlin, who was on their coaching staff, he got arrested for DUI over the bye week. And that's another thing to kind of factor in there. And this has just been kind of the trend for Maryland. I mean, going back beyond Mike Locksley to the short time that DJ Durkin was there, even going back to Randy Edsall. I mean, when I was a senior at Maryland, they were 4-0 through the first month of the season, ranked number 25, and then go and lose 63-0 to Jameis Winston and finish the year 7-5. I think that it really shows you the difference between a program like Penn State, like Michigan, like Ohio State, that has really been able to build up depth in addition to having good coaching. Where Penn State, we've talked about these injuries, and when guys are banged up, they have people who can step up and kind of keep everything churning, keep everything floating as it goes on. I felt like Maryland over these past few years, especially on the lines and the trenches, is that they really get worn down over the course of the season, and you start to see the bottom fall out. So it's going to be interesting to see what Maryland comes to play on Saturday. I think in my short time covering Penn State and kind of being adjacent to the program at my previous job, I think that one thing I've noticed is that you talk a lot about the hangovers and Ohio State beating you twice and everything, and I think that's something that's been very real under James Franklin. But I also think that kind of when these games are in the vacuum and when they're not, butting up to anything, super, pressing, I think that these teams always come out prepared. I feel like that I've never seen a Penn State team really get caught looking ahead. They might get caught looking back a little bit, like we almost saw against Indiana, but I don't think that they're going to be looking past Maryland, especially after having that close call against Indiana. So, Maryland, I think I'm really interested to see if Mike Locksley can pull them out of this slide. That's something that in the past we haven't. It feels like Maryland has kind of snuck in the bowl eligibility every once in a while, and that's what they're fighting for right now because they are 5-3 with Penn State, Nebraska, Michigan, and Rutgers remaining. So that's going to get dicey. That's a team that I think kind of has to decide how it wants its season to go.
Yeah, you could see them finishing out in Piscataway at 5-6 and needing a win to get to a bowl game after a 5-0 start. I mean, if people haven't been paying attention, Nebraska is suddenly winning football games, and Maryland's got to go play them. They've got Michigan, they've got Penn State. So yeah, good luck finding wins if Penn State handles its business on Saturday. Daniel, let's finish out before we get to Tyler Calvaruso on a bunch of recruiting notes. The college football playoff rankings make their 2023 debut on Tuesday night. Penn State, obviously, with the loss against them, they're going to need some help to jump back into the thick of things over the course of the next month, and they're not going to be able to pick up a second loss if they want to stay in the conversation. When you reviewed things, and I know you had a story up at Lions247.com here earlier Tuesday, where do you see Penn State landing, and how do you think kind of when they go shoulder to shoulder against some of these one-loss teams, they kind of stand out, or do they kind of fall back to the pack?
Penn State comes into this ranked number 9 in the AP poll and the coaches poll. I think that there's a chance that they'll probably be around 10 or 11 in the college football playoff rankings when those get announced on Tuesday night. I think that part of it has to do with Penn State's lack of ranked wins. I looked at some projections, and Georgia and Michigan aren't projected to have any ranked wins. But you look at what those teams have done in terms of handling their business, being impressive, no losses, and things like that. Whereas with Penn State, they have that loss against Ohio State on there, and they're going to need a little bit of help, I think, with their resume. You look at Iowa and West Virginia. Iowa 6-2, West Virginia's 5-3. If both those teams keep winning, maybe you could see them hovering around in the 20s a little bit. I always used to joke with the CFP rankings that there's always some Big Ten team because of the way that because of how imbalanced the conferences are. It felt like there's always some Big Ten West team that the upper tier teams played, and that team would get ranked, just slotted in there at number 25 to help the resumes a little bit. I felt like Northwestern was always like number 25, and it would boost the resume a little bit. And I think Penn State needs Iowa or West Virginia to sneak in there to make things better. But I don't know. You look at things moving forward, and I think it paints the picture that Penn State is really needs to beat Michigan. They're going to need some help, and they're going to need some help elsewhere in the conference or elsewhere in the country, because some of these SEC teams, they've got 2 ranked wins on their resumes. They're going to have the chance to make things look better. But yeah, I think that they'll be hovering around that 10 range. I mean, I do think this is a top 10 team, but wouldn't be a surprise to see them around 11 with some of the teams ranked behind them in the AP poll ahead of them in the CFP.
Yeah, I only recall one year where Penn State was in the debut top 4 of the college football playoff back in 2019, and they followed that up with a loss on the road against fellow unbeaten Minnesota. So it's always been kind of they have ground to make up in November situation, but when you've got the number 2 team in the country coming to your home stadium in a matter of a week and a half, that's a huge opportunity. And no matter how everyone's feeling about the Michigan matchup or even the Maryland matchup right now, you got a shot because of what the path is laid out in front of you. So, Daniel, appreciate the perspective. We'll get an answer on the initial placement for Penn State in those rankings tonight on a Tuesday. We're going to jump over to recruiting right now, but I'll catch up with you on the practice field Wednesday, and people can check out all the content you've got coming their way at Lions247.com.
Thanks, Tyler.
As promised, we've got recruiting to get to now, and the Nittany Lions were busy on Saturday, not just playing the Indiana Hoosiers, but hosting a bunch of prospects. Tyler Calvaruso was doing great reporting on the buildup of that confirmed visitors list, and since then, working to get feedback from everyone who was here on campus. Tyler, welcome back to the podcast.
Feels good to be back, man. Thanks for having me.
Of course. So we got a few things to get to. We're going to look up toward New England, where there is always interest on the recruiting trail for the Nittany Lions. We'll talk about some of those names, including a commit. But I want to get into this past matchup because it feels like it's been a while since we had a collection of recruits of great significance on campus. I don't want to really shortchange everyone who was around for the UMass game, but it was not the list by any means that we've seen game by game by game. And then you factor in a bye week and some road games. It's been a little while. So let's start with the 2025 names to monitor here, and included at a DePaul Catholic, Desi Jones, a top 200 prospect in that 2025 class, one of the premier wide receivers in the region, a few wide receivers that we'll get to here, but we'll start with Jones.
First trip to campus for Jones since he visited for the season opener against West Virginia. Toyed around with the idea of visiting for the whiteout, but he had a family party to attend that weekend, so that one did not come together for Penn State. It's always notable when Desi Jones winds up making it to campus. You know, there have been multiple times where it seemed like he was going to make the visit only for something to come up, and when he does make it, it's important because he is one of Penn State's top 2025 wide receiver targets. Things have been going well there for Penn State, I would say. You know, they continue to get Jones back to town, so that's always a plus. You know, there are a lot of people at DePaul Catholic who feel Penn State is a top contender to land Jones. He's got a lot of really quality options. His offer list is impressive. He recently visited Ohio State. He was actually at Ohio State. I believe it was when they played Penn State. So I believe the previous weekend. I'm going to have to go back and double check that to make sure. But he keeps, trending in the right direction. We got him ranked pretty highly, well inside the top 24/7 in our 2025 rankings. I got the chance to see him in person when they played Bishop McDevitt to open their season. He had a monster game, really a couple big plays. He had a touchdown that night. So you could see why Marcus Higgins of the Penn State staff is high on Desi Jones. So when you talk about the visitors from this past weekend, Jones is one of the top names who was in town. Things seem to be going well there. It's one that we're going to continue to monitor heading into the winter. When will he be back? We don't know quite yet, but I would expect him back at some point for sure.
And DePaul Catholic, they've produced some significant Power 5 talent in recent memory, and he is the all-time record holder for sophomore receiving yardage. He went over 1,000 yards last year as a sophomore, did Jones, helping put himself on the map. And as you said, Ohio State has offered. Texas put out an offer this summer. So it's a national recruitment, and he was back in town. Elsewhere at the wide receiver position, we'll go over to Christian Brothers Academy in the state of New York. Darian Williams, he's got some Power 5 offers. Coach Prime has put an offer on the table for him. So has Penn State. What do we make of Williams and his experience here?
So he had a really good visit. He picked up his offer from Penn State on Friday night, and less than 24 hours later on Saturday afternoon, he's inside Beaver Stadium. He was telling me this was a visit that he really always wanted to make. He camped at Penn State during the summer, had a really great experience during his time in State College, got to know the staff a little bit that day, enjoyed working with Marcus Higgins. And really from that point on, Penn State was a school that had definitely caught his eye and one that he wanted to see if they would take on a bigger role in his recruitment moving forward. That obviously happened with an offer coming in. Really just an overall positive experience for me. He told me Penn State's at the top of his list coming out, and he is starting to receive some more Big Ten interest. Rutgers is going to host him for a visit shortly. And I believe Maryland, yes, it's Maryland that is also showing some interest in Williams. His father actually was offered by the Terps back in the day when he was a high school recruit. He lives 20 minutes from Maryland's campus, so there's an element of intrigue as well there if Mike Loxley and his staff decide to offer. But right now, Penn State is the program standing out to Williams. Again, that 2025 wide receiver board is still coming together. I think the evaluation of Williams is still coming together as well. So we're going to have to see where he falls at the end of the day. But Penn State got a chance to make a positive first impression this past weekend, and it did exactly that.
We spend a lot of time talking receivers on the podcast these days, and let's talk about another one. Nashawn Montgomery, a third receiver recruit to get to here on campus. He's another top 200 overall talent in the 2025 class. He came long distance from Cardinal Newman in West Palm Beach, Florida, the number 19 wide receiver in 24/7 Sports rankings. He got about 30 scholarship offers to his credit. So, and originally from Rhode Island. Well, let's note that as well. Not necessarily a South Florida born and raised native. What do we make of this guy, Nashawn Montgomery, going a long distance? And it's an unofficial visit when you're that age. And what do we think about Penn State's placement in his recruitment process, which, as I said, down in Florida features about 36 teams?
Yeah, that was a pretty important note that you just dropped. He is a Northeast native. He's not your traditional Florida recruit who has that kind of intrigue and pull to the local programs down there. So that's not an element of Montgomery's recruitment. Now, let me say this as well. National Montgomery can play pretty much anywhere in the nation. That's how talented of a player he is, and that's what his offer list is looking like right now. So that's why it was important for Penn State to get him back on campus this past weekend. And actually, it got him on campus for a couple of days because Carl Newman had a bye week. So Montgomery and his quarterback, Jaron Hughley, who is Jaywan Sider's nephew, they made the trip. They got in town on Friday, stayed Saturday through the game. Both positive experience for them. But when it comes to Montgomery, I just feel like this visit was about him continuing to build his relationship with Marcus Hagans. As a guy who hasn't been around a whole lot compared to some of Penn State's other 2025 wide receiver targets. He was last on campus in April. Penn State had been trying to get him back, came together this past weekend. I received plenty of positive feedback coming out of this visit from Montgomery. He told me he had a great time. And I think the Nittany Lions will remain in contention moving forward. I do think it'll be a difficult pull for the Nittany Lions, but they're in the race. And I feel like at this juncture of Montgomery's recruitment, that's kind of all they could ask for because there still is a long way to go. He's still figuring out where he's going to be in the winter when it comes to visits, spring when it comes to visits. And once official visit season rolls around, he's still sorting through that as well. But Penn State is under consideration with Montgomery right now.
Well, I'll tell you what, Montgomery comes up to campus in late October. Right now, it's freezing out here. It's like, low 40s.
Yeah.
I got to take my little unicorn princess out trick-or-treating tonight. It's going to be very cold. It was like 70 degrees on campus on Saturday when he was up here from Florida. So that timing worked out pretty well to make a solid impression on the South Florida prospect. Let's talk about one more visitor from this matchup, and there's a lot of coverage on others at Lions247.com for our VIP subscribers, but a new offer went out, and it's in-state, 2025 linebacker Alex Taish. I hope I'm saying that wrong. Right. If I'm saying it wrong, it's our first time. We'll get it right the next time. But whenever they're offering an in-state linebacker, you're going to be like, okay, who is it and what's he all about?
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's pretty much where things have been at with him for a little bit. Penn State staff has been monitoring him for a while. They want to maintain that presence in Western Pennsylvania. And with him playing at Greater Latrobe, he was a guy who caught Penn State's eye in a pretty big way with his production throughout his junior season. He visited for the whiteout against Iowa, so this was not his first time on campus this season. But so he's already garnered a little bit of familiarity with the staff, and then he just continued to build on that this past weekend. You have to figure, and we always talk about Penn State when it comes to the in-state offers. They don't throw them out there like candy, man. If they go out, they open your eyes because there's, some legitimate juice behind them. So I think this recruitment is going to be one that we have to keep a really, really close eye on moving forward. That 2025 priority board is still, it's still in the works. The cycle is still early. You've already got DJ McClary on board at linebacker, but I'd anticipate, in-state offer, highly productive in-state offer at that. It's going to be one we're talking about a lot moving forward. So Alex Taish, he's a really good player, man. You turn on the film, you can see why this offer went out. And I think the feedback that we got from him when he got the chance to catch up with Brian Doan, it was all pretty positive for Penn State as we were anticipating.
Yeah, a bunch of feedback on that offer, what it means for him at Lions247.com, and more locally even than Penn State. Pitt has put out an offer. West Virginia has put out an offer. Your old friend Brent Pry at Virginia Tech has offered. Wisconsin, Duke, Cincinnati, some of the other opportunities on the table for the sophomore linebacker at Latrobe. One more name to get to. I think I said that was the final one. I lied. We're going back to Florida. Dia Bell. He was the big name that we discussed in our preview podcast before the Indiana matchup. A quarterback who's certainly on the rise at American Heritage High School in Fort Lauderdale. Got a few Power 5 offers. Florida, Miami are among them down there. He's also a big-time basketball player. His dad, Raja Bell, played in the NBA at a high level for 12 years, known for his defense, and he was in the stands. Tyler, what do we think about the impact here? And is Dia Bell a guy, although he's playing 1,000 miles away in high school ball, that you think we'll be seeing again in Happy Valley?
I think so. Based on what he had to say to me post-visit, I think so. I feel like the relationships with the Penn State staff, specifically the offensive staff with Mike Yurchis and Danny O'Brien, are coming along really nicely. Bell's been telling me most of his contact has come with O'Brien, and that relationship has gotten to a point where, they can discuss really anything. It's not just about football with them. They've garnered a pretty there's just a lot of comfortability there at this point. That definitely works in Penn State's favor, given the fact that O'Brien is taking on more and more of a role, as a graduate assistant. Yeah. And, he's played such a big part in Penn State's quarterback recruiting since he joined the staff. And you're seeing that with Dia Bell. So that's a positive for Penn State. Seems like he likes the offensive scheme in general as well. It's one that he feels that he can fit in. So that's obviously something that, Bell being a quarterback, he's keeping a very close eye on that throughout every visit he takes, not just his trips to Penn State. Every visit he takes, he's keeping a really close eye on scheme fit. He sees it at Penn State. And he's at 2026. And there's going to be a long way to go. He plays at a Florida power. So you're going to have the Florida school sniffing around. They've already got offers out to him. So that's going to be a factor that we have to keep an eye on. But I would anticipate Bell as a guy who definitely makes it back to campus for another visit, whether that be in the winter, the spring, the summer for another camp. Who knows right now? That's something that's, still very, very fluid. But Bell, when it comes to that 2026 quarterback board, he's up there and he will remain on there, I'd anticipate.
I mentioned that we're going to get into some New England recruiting conversation because Penn State doing pretty well there this cycle. They've hit it pretty hard the last few cycles. There are more names to know moving forward. But just as we were recording here, you sent me over a text, and Zahir Mathis, who we have seen on campus, we saw him walking around the camp field I think it was last summer. We did not see him participating that particular day, but you could see from the eye test why he was having Power 5 team swarm. Number 80 overall player in the top 24/7 rankings for the class of 2025 out of Imhotep in Philadelphia. He is the number 1 rated player for 24/7 Sports in Pennsylvania for that cycle, and he did not put Penn State on a top 5 list that he just released on Tuesday afternoon. What do we make sense of this? And again, Mathis isn't exactly a guy that we had been seeing grow familiar with Penn State in recent months or years.
It's the lack of inclusion of Penn State in that top 5. Frankly, it's not really a surprise. There's been an SEC draw throughout Mathis's recruitment, and the kid has a great relationship with Deion Barnes. It's not about that. There really just levels to this recruitment. And like I said, there is a draw to play in the SEC. Now, Penn State's going to see this top 5. Not going to be like, oh, well, that's it. We're not in the top 5. That's move on to the next one on the defensive line. No, they're going to keep at it with Zahir Mathis. I mentioned that relationship with Barnes being in a good place. I mean, as long as you have that relationship, Penn State's going to have a fighting chance to, maybe crack its way back into this recruitment. But right now, Mathis, he hasn't been around. He hasn't made any visits to campus recently, so that's notable. I think this is going to end in the SEC at the end of the day. I know he's still figuring things out and going through his process, but it just has that kind of feel to me at this point. So I'm not really anticipating Penn State being able to fight back in all the way and securing a commitment at the end. But the Nittany Lions are definitely going to keep trying, and Deion Barnes is definitely going to keep trying. Again, we're going to have to see how far that relationship can take Penn State in this recruitment. We saw it with Sione Laulea recently in this 2024 class, right? Penn State, he had that relationship with Terry Smith, and that brought the Nittany Lions right down to the wire in that recruitment. I think at this point, Penn State has to hope that the relationship with Mathis can at least, between Mathis and Barnes, can at least keep it within striking distance as his process continues to play out.
Mathis, 6'6", 225 pounds, the number 10 overall edge rusher in those 2025 rankings. And he's still got 14 months ahead of him before he puts pen to paper with that early signing period in his class. And those top 5, we should mention South Carolina and Tennessee out of the SEC. You've also got Texas heading to the SEC, Florida State and Ohio State, and round out that top 5 for Zahir Mathis on Halloween. Let's go to New England now. I know that wasn't the best news that people wanted to digest here in the center of our recruiting updates, but we don't always give the sugar-coated information here. So let's talk about New England, where there are a lot of possibilities. Brian Doan hit the road, made his tour. He gets up there pretty frequently, and no one knows the recruiting scene up in New England like our Brian Doan, which is great for us because we reap the benefits on our site, and so do our readers. And let's begin with the targets before we work our way toward a commit that he checked in on. And Adam Schoeflin was one of the most aggressive, you could say at least, defensive lineman that we saw in camp action this past summer as a rising junior from St. Thomas More in Oakdale, Connecticut. He's considered a top 50 defensive lineman in 24/7 Sports assessment. He's a high 3-star prospect. He's a guy that I came away with very impressed from some of that camp work. Penn State status and Chauvelin's status with the Nittany Lions.
Yeah, I liked him in a camp setting as well, and I think Penn State liked him in a camp setting as well. That 2025 defensive line board of Barnes is still sorting itself out. So Chauvelin, he's definitely in the mix at the position. Hasn't been to campus in a little bit, but he's a Pennsylvania native, and he's told me, really, he could just get down for a visit whenever it works out for him. So, that will probably occur at some point. He's kind of starting to narrow down his options a little bit too. When Brian caught up with him, it seems like he's zoning in on certain schools at this point of his recruitment, Penn State being one of them. So the Nittany Lions are definitely in that race. And again, that 2025 defensive line board, there's a pecking order. It's still coming together. And I feel like once his junior season wraps up, and the full film is out there, I think we'll have a better idea of where exactly he stands in the picture.
And also at St. Thomas More, Jordan Houston, a wide receiver prospect. I think he's labeled an athlete up at 247 Sports. But a guy who's seen the Big Ten offers start to come through. Again, one of those juniors. You talked so much about the 2025 wide receiver board, and there's a bunch of names on there. How does he fit into that conversation based on what you know?
I think that he's a guy who I would say, maybe not in that priority point right now, but definitely has the staff's attention because he attended the whiteout camp at the end of June. And I got the chance to really see a lot of wide receiver drill work that day. And he was getting a lot of attention from Marcus Hagans, and he was getting pulled to the side, getting pointers, doing one-on-one work. And this has been an offer. This was a camp offer going back to last summer, before Hagan was even in place. So the Penn State staff has known about Jordan Houston, who's a New York native. He started his career actually as teammates with Ty Blanding at Christ the King in New York. So Penn State has known about him for a really long time. So there's definitely a fair share of intrigue with Jordan Houston. And it's really not a surprise to me that these Big Ten offers are rolling in for him. I think he's a really dynamic wideout. The testing numbers have been a positive. He ran really well when he was at Penn State. Like I said, during drill work, he looked very, very fluid. His athleticism, you could just see it. Some guys struggle with camp drills. Houston wasn't one of them. Then once one-on-ones kicked off, he was solid there too. He won the majority of his reps. So he is definitely one of those names on the 2025 wide receiver board who, as things continue to play out, he'll be back and he'll continue to be on this, have the staff's attention.
So from one of the premier prep programs in Connecticut, which, by the way, is a state you'll find the number one tight end in the country for the 2024 class. That's Luke Reynolds. He's committed to Penn State at a Cheshire Academy up in Connecticut. He will be here on campus in January, adding to that tight end unit. But over in Massachusetts at the Dexter School, you find another Penn State commit, Liam Andrews, and one of the more intriguing members of this entire 2024 class. Initially, a big-time offensive line target for the Nittany Lions, ultimately a key defensive line addition for Penn State back in July. Really curious to hear what you make of Brian Doan's commentary coming off that visit with Liam Andrews. And now that we've got a couple months of him actually being on the field, what you think about his ability to come here to Penn State and truly make an impact on the defensive front.
I really think, Brian's headline where it mentions Liam Andrews improving his technique, that's probably my biggest takeaway with this, because given the fact that his focus was on the offensive line at the early stage of his recruitment, and that, took up a lot of his attention for a long time. He was always a really good defensive lineman at Dexter School. Everyone in the region knew that. But now that he knows, and when he really started to desire to play the position at the next level, he's really been locked in on just getting better and better really every single day. Every time he takes the practice field, every time he gets a chance to play a game, I think improving his technique and just really refining himself as a defensive lineman and kind of, calming down and, just getting comfortable with all the responsibilities of playing the position. I think he's definitely taken some steps forward in that regard. That is something that the Penn State staff has really liked to see out of him, because there is some pretty high hopes about what he's going to be able to accomplish when he makes it to campus. He has continued to hold a pretty lofty place in our rankings despite the position change. And there's a reason for that. He's coming along and his ceiling is high. Sometimes when guys change and they flip to the sides of the line, they drop a little bit in the rankings just because the fact of the matter is their ceiling on one side of the ball is higher than the ceiling on the other side of the ball. With Andrews, his ceiling is high on either side of the ball, and defensive line is going to be his home at the next level. And I really think that he's going to fit in nicely on that Penn State defensive line in a year or two being on campus. I really do. I think he has the work ethic, not to necessarily be a contributor right off the bat, but he could be one of those guys who, when he does make it to campus and he goes through the offseason weight program and spring ball rolls around, then he gets going through fall camp. When his name pops up as, freshman to know entering into the season, if that happens, wouldn't surprise me in the slightest. I think Liam Andrews has that kind of makeup.
Really, the only defensive linemen that we've seen come into this program and show up on the field as true freshmen have been the ones who, had some pedigree coming in. I mean, Jameel Lyons is the latest one, and maybe he wasn't buzzed enough about, but he was a 4-star prospect in 24/7 Sports rankings. PJ Mustipher played as a true freshman. He was a top 100 overall prospect. Adiza Isaac was a highly regarded recruit. He played as a true freshman. Zane Durant last year, but usually linemen are going to redshirt. That's typically the process, is that both sides of the ball, you're going to see those guys take a year, maybe get 4 games of regular season work, and then see what you've got in year number 2. But we'll see. 6'5", 260 pounds right now. Liam Andrews, the number 20 overall defensive lineman, and a high 4-star, just on the edge of top 100 overall status in 24/7 Sports assessment. He's not the only lineman to keep an eye on there at Dexter. You've also got Hardy Watts, who's a year younger than Andrews. He's in that 2025 class, but considered one of the premier linemen in New England for that cycle. And he's also a guy who's got Penn State interested in, offered in, Maryland, Miami, Michigan State, among the other offers that he has to this point. So South Carolina, Texas A&M, very national flavor with Hardy Watts. So what does it mean for Penn State to have one of his teammates in Liam Andrews committed? And what do you think Hardy Watts' prospect profile in New England as a junior with all those offers speaks about his talent level?
Well, first off, when it comes to his prospect profile, I don't think we're going to have to worry about a late switch of a desired position at the next level. I think he's going to be sticking on the offensive line, and he's a damn good one. So that worked for him. Penn State has his attention. I think Andrews being committed to the Nittany Lions and those two being teammates at Texas school, it definitely helps. But the big thing with Watts to note is he's pretty high on academics in his recruitment. The academics of each school involved in his process, it's a very, very important thing to him. A lot of that has to do with the fact that he comes from a family with a pretty strong academic background. So it's kind of one of those values that's been instilled in him really from a young age. So it's no surprise that that's carrying over into his recruitment. I think Penn State's done a pretty good job pitching Watts so far. They have hosted him previously. They're looking to get him back on campus, and that's in the works. And he's going to be checking out, that I mentioned the academics, schools like Duke. That's going to be a program that is on his radar moving forward. He's visited Vanderbilt. Again, another strong academic institution. And he has had praise for the academics of those two programs. Nebraska is in the mix as well. I know it's a little bit of a different ilk than Duke and Vandy, but it's still a Big Ten program that has Watts' attention. So I think Penn State has put itself in a pretty solid spot early on. I think the pitch on and off the field has been pretty positive. Andrews has had a lot of good things to say to him about the program and the program's trajectory. So that works in the Nittany Lions' favor. But we'll see when he makes it back to campus how things go, because that is a recruitment that has a lot of parts to it that go beyond the football field.
All right, Tyler, we spent a lot of time looking toward the future here, 2025, 2024 guys, even 2026 quarterback prospect. But let's take a quick moment here before we finish the podcast to review what's going on with the 2023 recruiting class for the Nittany Lions. It was the number 14 overall haul in 24/7 Sports signing day rankings last winter. 23 total prospects came on board from that group. Of course, Mega Barnwell did not last long with the program, a tight end who was with the team for spring ball. But this is a bunch of players that we didn't think would show up, and certainly not like the 2022 class, Tyler, where you had, by the time we got to November, rising national stars and Nick Singleton and Katron Allen, and you had Denai Dennis Sutton, and of course Abdul Carter at linebacker, and you eventually need Drew Shelton to step up at tackle for you. It's a long list of guys who ended up burning red shirts last year, 10 of them. So far, there's 4 who have burned red shirts on the defensive side of the football. Safety King Mack, cornerbacks Elliott Washington and Zion Tracy, and then you also have linebacker Tony Rojas. Now, Jameel Lyons hit the 4-game red shirt threshold against Indiana on Saturday. He saw some limited work. Penn State was without top defensive end Chop Robinson, without one of the primary backups in Amin Vanover. So those are the 5 guys that we have seen play 4 games or more to this point. And we'll see if Lyons crosses it and joins that redshirt territory. Everybody else to this point in that freshman class is at 2 games or less. There are several players who have not played in a game yet. Tyler, what surprises you most thus far, whether it's an individual who's been able to get out there or not been able to get out there, and then collectively with this freshman unit?
To be completely honest with you, not a whole lot has really surprised me about this group. I think the one thing that I will say is Lyons is definitely making an impact earlier than I thought he might. And that's not because I wasn't high on him coming out. I think me and you have always agreed that when we got to see Lyons just around campus, not participating in camp settings while a commit, but just showing up to these camps, he already had the bill of a guy who could play in the Big Ten. But you thought it might take him maybe a year or two to get going and crack that rotation. I mean, he's already been able to do that as a true freshman to at least some degree. So that's definitely a huge positive for his development, where he's heading. I think maybe that's the one thing that surprised me a little bit. But based on preseason, some of the preseason feedback that we received, I think a lot of these guys are where we expected them to be at this point in the season. Maybe you could pinpoint Anthony Donka as a surprise to some degree as well, because, coming in, we didn't talk about him a whole lot. We were obviously talking about the really, really highly ranked guys in Javen Williams and Alex Birchmeier. Donka kind of flew under and Chimdi Ono as well as a late riser. Donka he flew under the radar a little bit. But when it came to the feedback that we received throughout the preseason, I mean, he was one of Penn State's better true freshmen. That's not just better true freshman offensive lineman, better true freshman overall. So that was notable. So I think maybe you could classify that as a little bit of a surprise as well. But when it comes to the reps these guys have played, the situations that they've played in, I know a lot of the majority of the guys who've already burned red shirts, the majority of their reps have come on special teams. They've gotten the chance to play some defensive snaps, but, not really necessarily in high leverage situations. A lot of those guys have seen a lot of work on special teams. So I think really everything right now, it's kind of what I was anticipating based on some of the conversations we had during the preseason. And I'll say this, I think that it is still a really, really solid group that has the potential to make a big impact at Penn State. I think you're seeing it with some of the guys on special teams. Penn State staff, they're not running them out there if they're not confident in them, right? You got to go out in special teams and make plays. All those guys have been able to do that. So there's a lot of confidence in this group. I think they're going to all continue to collectively come along.
It probably says something about the holes that existed on the Penn State roster coming out of the 2021 season, when they went from, I think, 5-0 to 7-6, and they lost a lot of guys to the draft, and the talent they needed to kind of just get onto the field and figure out a way. Thus far, they've been able to lean on a lot of their veterans, and unfortunately for Penn State, they don't have some shining star wide receiver freshman to turn to. They got Carmelo Taylor, who's a developmental speed prospect, smaller player, a one-man wide receiver class. So when you think about positions that maybe could use someone right now immediately, maybe some of your best prospects, Andrew Rapier ends up in a tight end room that's loaded at the top, and right now he's not available. He's been out the last couple games. Elliott Washington and Zion Tracy, they both were involved on defense for much of the early season stretch. And every week on special teams, Elliott Washington didn't play this past week. We don't know why, but he wasn't available. But at the end of the day, they're not playing on defense right now. We go through the last couple of weeks, and only 4 total snaps in the last 2 games have gone to a freshman. So it's pretty remarkable. That's Jamil Lyons. Everything else has been special teams coverage work. We saw Tony Rojas and Zion Tracy and Elliott Washington and King Mack in kickoff coverage recently. But again, it's just been interesting that it hasn't spilled over for anyone. It's really in terms of defensive game reps. And I guess that speaks to the health of the team overall. But also, it says something about, I guess, just how Manny Diaz and how Mike Yurcich are evaluating the pros and cons of playing some of these freshmen. King Mack stands out to me as a guy who would be playing a ton of defensive football for a lot of schools, and including Penn State if they didn't have such a really good situation at safety. I think he was 18 plus snaps at 3 different games here, Tyler, but he's now 4 consecutive conference matchups where they haven't used him on defense.
Yeah.
They're sticking to their top 4 safeties who they know, who they trust. And so you've got a lot of this talent brewing in the background, but not necessarily giving you a boost, maybe on the practice field, but not giving you a boost on Saturdays toward a Big Ten championship. And I'm curious what to make of Alex Birchmeier. This is a guy I hope to be able to follow up, as the season, get into December, and you can have more conversations about, big picture stuff and developmental stuff. Alex Birchmeier isn't really a name that comes up week to week for us right now in covering Penn State football, but Tyler, he's been relegated to the scout team, every step of the way since we've watched this team. We've seen Anthony Donka have his moments early. They haven't loved him enough to burn his red shirt. They've gotten other guards involved. They come up with other solutions at guard. But they got him involved early. They got Javen Williams involved early. We've even seen Chimdi Ono, who by all accounts was a relatively raw prospect coming out of high school. We've even seen him out there for a couple games. And Alex Birchmeier, in a lot of ways, we kind of viewed him as more of a known commodity, I suppose is the way to do it. Winning a couple of state championships on the wrestling mat, big-time college, high school career, big-time college recruit. And yet we haven't seen him involved in game action. So I would point to Birchmeier and the 2 running backs. For me, as we get to December, and we get a chance to look back, because those 2 running backs, Cam Wallace and London Montgomery, have been tucked away as well. We've seen them in practice. We haven't seen them on Saturdays. And Jaywan Sider, not just at Penn State, but his entire career as a running backs coach, has never applied a red shirt to a freshman running back. He's about to do it to two of them. And it sounds like Cam Wallace has been ready to make an impact if called upon. I'm still curious if he's like an X-factor weapon that they take off the kid gloves and get him involved for a couple games, maybe involve him for some touches, but they're running out of time to do it. And it sounds like London Montgomery still has some ground to make up physically coming off that knee injury as a senior. So, throw Carmelo Taylor in there. It's just interesting to me, Tyler, because so much of the freshman conversation right now isn't about what can this team do to help the Nittany Lions win a 2023 Big Ten championship. It's about what can this freshman class do to improve itself behind the scenes and then show up to spring practice next March and April and really start to assert itself up the depth chart. And I think that's a little bit tough for people to wrap their heads around, because you look for all the infusion of talent, whether it's the transfer portal or the freshman classes, to give you a leg up maybe and help you drive toward the college football playoff. And thus far, even you look at the transfers and the impact, it's just a lot of familiar names for the Nittany Lions. Some of them have taken a step forward. Some of them have seemingly regressed, but we're not seeing that big dash or big jolt of fresh names, fresh faces out there.
Sometimes I think some collective recruiting classes, some just come along quickly compared to others, right? Every player who goes from high school to college, they got to take that jump, and it's an adjustment, for some more than others. It's a process, and it's a process that the Penn State staff, it works to get these guys prepared to play, whether it be immediately or, a little bit down the road this year, next year. It's something that the Penn State staff, they make sure that these guys are ready to roll. It's something that James Franklin has said publicly as well. If you're not preparing, like if you're a freshman right now and you're not getting a whole lot of playing time, it is what it is. But if you're not preparing, like you're going to be on the field and playing a big role, you're not going to be ready when your number is actually called moving forward to take on a spot on the 2 deep there or even in the starting lineup. So all these guys are preparing to really take on bigger roles in the future. And it's definitely been a class that hasn't made that necessarily instant impact like the 2022 class, but it's still one Penn State feels will be able to accomplish a lot down the road. So, I think that everything that we just talked about, it shouldn't be viewed as like an indictment of the class, the fact that these guys aren't on the field right now collectively making a ton of plays. I don't think that speaks to a lack of talent among the group by any stretch. I just think it's kind of a product of circumstance and guys coming along at their own speed. One other surprise, just listening to you talk, I think one other surprise I kind of slipped my mind, I thought maybe Tony Rojas might be a little bit more on the field, because the offseason feedback with him was really glowing, and it's still been glowing. There's no doubt. I just thought, maybe at some point this freshman season we'd see him playing a really big role in the linebacker rotation, not necessarily a la Abdul Carter, but maybe a little bit in that sense with the snap count. I think he's got the talent to be that kind of player. If it doesn't happen this year for him, I think it's definitely going to be next year. I'm really high on Tony Rojas and his ability to make an impact moving forward.
And what you got to remember here is if you want to get a freshman on the field, you've got to take somebody off the field.
It's tough,
and
man.
That's the tougher part of the conversation, especially with a veteran-laden roster.
No doubt.
Right now, a lot of guys who have played Big Ten games in the past. And I'll just note this. Through October of 2022, Drew Shelton had about 20 total game snaps. He started at left tackle for you the last 5 games, including the Rose Bowl.
Yep.
So you never know when an injury above
That's
them on the depth chart could dictate us seeing some of these newcomers a little bit more prevalent in game action. But I appreciate you giving us some perspective there. Again, I want to follow up with you. You said we're not an indictment, just the dynamics of this roster right now. It's where the freshman class is. That's where the involvement is. I just thought it was a good time to kind of address that, because we haven't had a chance to really do that on the podcast. I do a weekly piece that's keeping track of the redshirt situation for Penn State. But here on the podcast, I thought it was a good time to look back, and who better to do it with than you, who covered the class so well before they got here to campus. Tyler Calvaruso, great stuff. Plenty for our VIP subscribers at Lions247.com. 30% off an annual subscription, $1 for 1 month. You'll get a good look at what Tyler Calvaruso does for us on a daily basis covering Penn State recruiting. Appreciate you, man.
Thanks for having me back, man. Appreciate it.
Fantastic work from Tyler. Before him, Daniel Gallen, both my colleagues at Lions247.com. We're getting back to work over there now. We'll get back to the podcast on Thursday with a preview edition for the Maryland matchup. We'll take a closer look at what the Terps are bringing to the field, and we'll let you know what we saw and heard from the Penn State practice facilities on Wednesday night, all leading up to a 3:30 kickoff in College Park on Saturday. Stepping aside for now, thanks as always for watching and listening. My name is Tyler Donahue. This has been the Lions 24/7 podcast.